part of the church's witness to confront the powers and the authorities with the message of the gospel, not just in words, but also in action.
Hello and welcome to Talking Theology, the podcast of Cranmer Hall in Durham. My name is Nick Moore and I'm your host today, and we are speaking in this episode with Barnabas Aspray about the question of how we should think about immigration policy. Barnabas, welcome to Talking Theology.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Can you tell us a bit about yourself? And you're working at St Mary's Seminary. Tell us a bit about where that is and what that work involves.
Yeah, there's too many places called St Mary's. This one is officially St Mary's Seminary and University, and it's on the east coast of America, in the city of Baltimore. And I was hired here 3 years ago to teach systematic theology to students who will, if they finish the program, they'll become Catholic priests. So I teach things like Christology, ecumenism, interreligious dialogue, fundamental theology, and the doctrine of God, and things like the Trinity, that sort of thing.
That's excellent. Now, immigration policy is obviously quite a hot button contested issue at the moment. Tell us how you first got involved in thinking about that from a theological perspective.
Yeah, so I think, well, before I got interested in it theologically, I guess I got interested in it just because my church was starting a charity. I was part of a church in northwest London, which started a charity called Refugee Education UK. I don't know if you've heard of it. And I just got involved because there were several members of the church who were very passionate about supporting refugees and working with refugees. And I guess that raised my awareness of the situation of refugees. And before that, I'd sort of grown up in an evangelical home that always prized care of the poor and the disadvantaged as part of the gospel witness, I guess. So it always was an obvious match. Then theologically, I started a research project at Pembroke College, Oxford. I won a research fellowship to investigate what a Christian theology of refugees and immigration might look like. So I've been working at this sort of at an academic level since 2019.
It's interesting it started with church involvement for you, because I guess some people would think this is such a contested issue, the church should just steer clear of it altogether. What would you say to that?
Well, I'm not sure the church has ever steered clear of contested issues in its whole history. You don't get martyrs from a community who avoids divisive topics.
That's true.
And it would have to, it's part of the church's witness to confront the powers and the authorities with the message of the gospel, not just in words, but also in action.
Yeah, excellent. So tell us a bit about how, what came out of that research project. How is it you think Scripture can and should shape our approach to immigration?
Well, it's a funny thing because I grew up evangelical with a strong focus on Bible reading, and my parents would read the Bible to us every day. And I felt like I knew the Bible pretty well. But when I started this research project, I found myself asking the question, does the Bible say anything about immigration and refugees? I'm not sure. And then it was like the scales dropped from my eyes at part way through, looking through the different Bible passages and being like, oh my gosh, how did I never see this before? The Bible talks about this everywhere. Like almost every character in the Bible was a migrant. Actually, almost all of them were even refugees at a certain point. And the second most frequent command in the Pentateuch, in the Old Testament law, involves treatment of foreigners. The most frequent command is honoring God. Mm-hmm. But after that, it's how you treat the foreigner. And of course, very famously, we see that Jesus himself had a refugee experience. And he also says in that famous eschatological picture in Matthew 25, I was a stranger and you welcomed me. Mm-hmm. So when you look for it, you suddenly find it everywhere.
That's excellent. And I don't think I've actually said, but you've written a book which has come out of this project, which is called On the Significance of Religion in Immigration Policy. In the book, you say it's easier to draw out implications of Scripture for our personal response as Christians than it is for national immigration policy. Why is there that distinction?
Yeah, so I should say that book, that the title's not super exciting, but I didn't have a choice in the title because it was part of a series that are all called On the Significance of religion in X,
Right.
And so I had to pick, But, I think looking through the Bible, it's hard to avoid or escape all of the commands to welcome and love the stranger and care for the foreigner, and although, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament. But what becomes controversial is when you say whether or not that kind of welcome and love and care should be done at the national political level. Everybody can agree that an individual Christian should welcome and care for whatever refugees happen to be in their midst. But of course, nobody gets to be a refugee unless the nation has granted them entry to the country and refugee status. So where Christians start to disagree is not on whether you should love a refugee who's already there, but whether a nation, and to what extent a nation, should allow immigrants into the country in the first place, and what Christianity might have to say about that.
And as you say that, I think even in the nation of Israel in the Old Testament, it is often about the individual's response to the person who might glean on the edge of their field, rather than a sort of national choice. I know nation states didn't exist in the same way back then as they do today, but that is quite a striking distinction, isn't it?
Exactly, and it's a very it's also a challenging question about the relationship of Christians to the Old Testament, because there are several commands in the Pentateuch about how, like, Israel as a nation should treat strangers and give them certain legal rights and privileges, but of course, Christianity has never identified with a particular nation. Christians belong to every nation, and then how do we relate? What is the relationship between church and state, essentially? And very, very few Christians think that the church should be ultimately identified with the state. So if the two are separate, then it's a complicated and difficult question what the state's responsibilities are in relation to its Christianness.
And so coming back to something that is squarely New Testament territory, what do you think is the theological and ethical significance of the fact that, according to the Gospels, Jesus was a refugee, and particularly Matthew's Gospel with the flight to Egypt?
Yeah, so I wrote an article about that. It's just called Jesus Was a Refugee, Unpacking the Theological Implications. But the article's actually open access, so anybody can just download it for free. First, I'd just like to say that I think Jesus being a refugee was not a sort of accidental happenstance, that something that might or might not have happened in Jesus' life. Matthew says in Matthew chapter 2 that it was a fulfillment of a prophecy. And that suggests that it needed to happen so that Jesus could fulfill his role as the Messiah. And I think this is because Jesus needed to sort of undergo the same experiences as Israel so that he could stand as Israel's representative in the sort of theology of recapitulation. Israel as a nation experienced refugeehood, both fleeing slavery in Egypt and then being exiled to Babylon. And so Jesus had to have that same experience so that he could stand in representing Israel. But Jesus, of course, doesn't only represent Israel, he represents the whole human race. And so I go on to argue in that article that there's a sense in which all humanity is living in exile from the Garden of Eden since Adam and Eve, in perhaps a symbolic or representative way, but that doesn't necessarily mean any less real. We all feel a certain sense of disjointedness or disconnect due to sin and due to the fall. And so Jesus represents all of humanity by having a refugee experience. And then finally, the church is often described as aliens and exiles in the world. Not only in the New Testament, in like 1 Peter, for example, but also in some of the early apostolic letters after the New Testament, like 1 Clement or the Epistle to Diognetus, very fond of this trope that Christians are strangers. They don't really belong anywhere in the world. And Paul says our citizenship is in heaven in Philippians 2, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and actually needing to take that imagery with full seriousness rather than simply it being a kind of illustrative throwaway remark.
Exactly. And what does it mean to take it seriously? Well, I think it means that we're not supposed to ever feel completely at home, even in what we might conventionally call our native country or our country of citizenship, because our heavenly citizenship supersedes that. It's a higher loyalty and a higher allegiance. And I think that just changes our attitude towards any immigrants, because they're no longer people coming into our country It's not our country any more than it's their country. All countries belong to God. And as Christians, we don't identify precisely with one particular worldly country because we identify with the heavenly kingdom instead.
That's fantastic. As a kind of theological take on the historical reality that we're all immigrants if you go far enough back.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Now, you've got a vignette in the book on the Twitter spat between Vice President J.D. Vance and a British political commentator, Rory Stewart, about the Ordo Amoris. Could you just tell us what is the Ordo Amoris and what was that fight about?
Yeah, the funny thing was I'd already finished a draft of the manuscript for the book before that happened. And then I had to go back and add all of that stuff because it was just far too relevant to the book to leave out. And there was just a few months before it went out to publication. Basically, it was, I think, either in January or February 25 when the Vice President of the US, J.D. Vance, just casually said in a television interview, oh, there's this Christian concept that, you need to love your family first, and then your neighbor, and then your local community, and then your national community. And then if you've got any love left, you can give it to strangers and foreigners and the rest of the world, as it were. And Rory Stewart, who I think at the time was quite a recent convert to Christianity, he thought that Vance was referring to Jesus' command to the disciples to love one another. And he said that's a really bizarre way of reading it. But actually, J.D. Vance just responded, no, it's not. It's not about the command to love one another. It comes from this long-standing Christian idea called the Ordo Amoris, which is, of course, Latin. Got to love a bit of Latin, especially when theological Latin gets 11 million views on Twitter. It doesn't happen very often.
Has the advantage of being concise, doesn't it? So it'll fit in a tweet.
Yeah, it's true. But it means order of loves, right? So it pictures concentric circles of responsibility, which is largely the way J.D. Vance put it, although what he forgot was that God should always be the first love. And then your primary responsibility is actually to your own soul. He says that as well. Because you should never do anything that puts your own soul in danger. So there's a few quibbles with the way J.D. Vance put it, but ultimately he was essentially expressing something that the Christian tradition has always held, which is that you should make sure that your own family's basic needs are cared for before you start to look to the needs of a stranger.
And so what do you think is the right way to understand the Ordo Amoris, and what do you think might be some of the problems with the way that was being deployed? Yeah,
so I mean, I think the funny thing about that J.D. Vance statement is I don't think there was anything wrong with what he actually said. What was problematic was how that was used as a way of justifying an immigration regime which many, many Christians in America have identified as really quite un-Christian because of the lack of dignity that it shows for immigrants and the lack of respect for basic human rights. And I think it's just so easy to use the Ordo Amoris as a sort of excuse to ignore anybody who's not your own family and your own fellow citizens, because as long as I have family, I can always show them more love and more attention. And so I never get around to caring for the stranger and the foreigner because there's always my family who's there. But if you go back and look at some of the original sources on the Ordo Amoris, so Thomas Aquinas being one of the most important ones, he says, okay, you should love your father more than a stranger. Not hard to disagree with. But then he says, if your father's not in desperate need and the stranger is, then there will be times when the right thing to do is to prioritize the needs of the stranger. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a whole aspect of the Ordo Amoris that J.D. Vance sort of left out of his picture. That, it's about caring for the most basic needs. And of course, anybody who ignores the basic needs of their family, who leaves their own family hungry or homeless because they're caring for strangers, you'd think that there was something seriously wrong with that. Mm-hmm. But once your family's basic needs are cared for, you no longer have an excuse to avoid our Christian responsibility for the poor and marginalized and the underprivileged. And I think that's the bit that was missed out of the whole equation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And scaling that up, would you say there could be any place within which a national government could say we prioritise the needs of our current citizens over the needs of those who might arrive as migrants?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the same kind of thing, right? Of course, a government should care first and foremost for its own citizens, but it doesn't need to be seen as a sort of zero-sum game. Mm. And especially at the economic level, it never is a zero-sum game. All of the economists I've talked to agree that immigrants are always a net benefit to the economy. Refugees are initially an initial outlay of cost, but the statistical studies over years have shown that it takes 7 years before a refugee has paid off all of the initial costs that were spent on their welcome and integration and is starting to contribute back to the economy. Yeah. But the other thing is, every nation is always going to have its own internal problems. It's always going to have a handful of homeless and unemployed. How few problems does a nation need to have before it can afford to give a tiny fraction of its resources to, say, international aid, for example? How wealthy does a nation have to be before it can still give most of its resources to its own citizens, but also turn its attention outwards? And, we're talking about some of the wealthiest nations in the world here. We're talking about North American and European nations. If they can't afford to do anything for people who have lost their homes and their property and their livelihood and fled for their lives, then who can? And when can we ever do that?
And it's interesting because we began by pointing out that the confusion over, is this about love your neighbour, or is it actually about the order of Amoris, the order of love in the Christian tradition? It's more about the latter, but it does remind me of the question that prompts the parable of the Good Samaritan, which is, and who is my neighbour? Where
yes.
The limits of the love that I have to extend.
And that's exactly how Pope Francis responded to J.D. Vance, didn't he? He said the true order amoris is the one that is expressed in the parable of the Good Samaritan. Mm. And it is an ambiguity in the order amoris. If you look at, for example, St. Augustine's approach to it, he says, he doesn't actually say you should love some people more than others. He says all people should be loved equally, but because your own resources are limited and finite, you can't give to everybody equally. So you should give to and support and care for the people who are most proximate to you. Now, of course, does proximate mean blood relations? Or does it mean physical proximity? Or does it mean the people who are placed in your path, like the Good Samaritan shows, right? The Samaritan was a stranger. Well, the Jew who was on the road was a stranger to the Samaritan, but he was close to him physically, and that was why the Samaritan went out of his way to care for him. And if that's the case, then you could take that parable and apply it very clearly to refugees who are knocking on our borders, asking for entry, right?
Now, in the book, you identify a paradox in Christian immigration ethics, which goes along these lines. If Christian values include welcoming others who don't share Christian faith or heritage, that in turn might threaten the preservation of those Christian values. Could you say a little bit more about that paradox and how you think Christians should respond to that?
Yeah, so this is a response to what I've heard in many different quarters among sort of more right-wing Christians in Hungary, in Poland, in the UK, and in America, where they say, okay, we as a nation, or even as a continent, in the case of Europe, are founded on Christian values. We have Christian values in our nation. We're a Christian nation traditionally. And in order to preserve those Christian values, we need to limit immigration from people who don't share those values, because that's the only way of preserving them. If millions and millions of Muslims come into our nation, then it's going to dilute and threaten the social cohesion that comes from those Christian values. And so the Christian thing to do is to keep Muslims or Hindus or whatever out so that we can protect those Christian values. And basically what I try to suggest in the book is that, well, first of all, if one Christian value is welcome and love of the stranger, then you don't protect Christian values by keeping strangers out. You actually destroy Christian values because you're not living those Christian values out yourself. So you're undermining your own argument if you're not welcoming strangers, since welcoming strangers is one of the values of Christianity. But then I would sort of take it level deeper theologically and say, well, what does self-protection, what role does self-protection have in the gospel? Jesus says things like, whoever loses their life for my sake will find it, whereas those who try to save their life will lose it. And in Philippians 2, we're given a picture of somebody who doesn't try to seize and grasp hold of their status and their rights, but rather relinquishes them. And because they are relinquished, they are given back tenfold. You know, Jesus is exalted to the highest place. And so it may just be a paradox that self-protective defensive instinct is not a fundamentally Christian way of thinking about anything. We need to be vulnerable. We need to be willing to lose our life and trust that the power of the gospel is strong enough to protect itself. It doesn't need us to protect it. We should rather, instead of seeing, millions of Muslims coming into a country, even though that's not actually happening, it's always a bit of hype. But if it did happen, we should see it rather as an opportunity to share the gospel rather than a threat to our own values.
Yeah, thank you. So in a way, you're saying it's not really a paradox at all, and you've got to pay attention to what it is you might lose simply by attempting to be defensive.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, what I found, especially in the case of Hungary, I mean, Viktor Orban's now just recently lost power, but he talked a lot about preserving Christian values, but he rarely ever talked about what those Christian values were. And the thing is, what those Christian values are leave in question whether we should be reacting the same way as every other nation in this sort of defensive, self-interested way.
Yeah. Let's take the analogy of the individual or the individual family again. If we looked at a Christian family who were wanting to offer hospitality and welcome to others, including others who didn't share their beliefs, it would seem that there's a kind of limit on the number of people they could welcome whilst maintaining their identity or capacity as a Christian family. Do you think the same thing could apply to a nation as a whole, or does that analogy not quite work there?
Well, I think it can. I don't think there's I think we need to be realistic as well as being idealistic. There's a sort of tension there between the sort of ideal gospel values that we want to strive for and an acceptance of the reality that we're faced with. I don't think God asks us to do things that are unwise or foolish, even at the political level. And in that sense, there may be a limit to the number of immigrants that a nation can rightly welcome. I just don't think we're even close to reaching that limit yet, in spite of what right-wing media will often warn us about or be a bit alarmist about. And I think I found a very interesting discussion in a book by Luke Bretherton, who's now the Regius Professor of ethics at Oxford. He basically says, look, if refugees are fleeing a situation of such severe political disruption that the government can no longer protect them, then the only reason they would want to enter your nation is if your nation is still sufficiently cohesive and functional that it can protect them. So Bretherton says a nation should welcome refugees up to the point where welcoming more refugees would so disrupt its political structure that it could no longer offer protection to them. Because then at that point, there's no point in the refugee coming anymore. It's not coming to a better situation. So we need to still have something worth offering to refugees and immigrants. And if we welcome too many of them, then we're not going to have that thing worth offering anymore.
But still, it's partly the pull of the perception that certain European, North American countries can offer that, which is probably a reasonable perception that is part of what draws them, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And we're so Western centric sometimes. We don't seem to realize that many other nations in the world are struggling with far larger proportionate levels of immigration. Lebanon or Turkey, for example, or Aruba. They're facing huge proportions of immigrants in their country, far more than any Western nation is dealing with at the moment. And so, yeah, we can afford to do a whole lot more than we're actually doing without not only without causing trouble to our own economy, but actually, strangely enough, it would actually benefit us in the long run, which is a hard message to get across to people who see it all as a threat. There's an emotional instinct there that needs to be fought against. Actually, immigrants can do a great deal to enrich the economy and the culture.
Thank you. Now, you've mentioned Viktor Orban in Hungary. You're in the States. Obviously, the United States has a long history of a kind of public Christian faith, which seems almost ironic to us in Britain, given that there is a separation of church and state. Nevertheless, Christianity is sort of worn publicly in a way that it's hard to envisage here, despite the fact we have an established church. Nevertheless, in recent years, we have begun to see more of an emergence of rhetoric or language of Christian values, and the UK as a Christian nation, and we perhaps see some of that. The signs are mixed, aren't they? But we see some of that perhaps with recognition of the Christian roots of the St. George's flag, for example.
Yes.
Do you think that any nation can and should be described as a Christian nation? And perhaps you want to offer a specific comment on the UK?
Oh man, I mean, it just depends what you mean, right? Like, there's any number of definitions of a Christian nation. Does it mean a nation that has only Christians in it? Does it mean a nation that was founded with Christian intent? Or does it mean a nation whose laws and policies conform to Christian moral principles? I don't know. I mean, perhaps you could just say a Christian nation is a nation that treats people, both citizens and foreigners, the way Jesus would. But that's very hard to cash out in terms of concrete public policy and that kind of thing. I think a nation, a truly Christian nation, would be hospitable and welcoming to non-Christians, even if that meant that then there were more non-Christians in the nation. And again, this comes back to the paradox we were talking about a little bit. Like, do we trust that the gospel has the power that the truth will out in the end, or are we just afraid and defensive and fearful of losing some kind of Christian identity, as if it was something we had to fight for on our own efforts and in our own strength? Ultimately, I do think that there are Christian values embedded in the UK's sort of laws and customs and policies, and I think that's a good thing. But one of those values that is crucial to hold on to is the value of hospitality and care for the disadvantaged and marginalized. And if we're not welcoming immigrants who are in desperate need, then we're not preserving that value anymore.
So part of what I hear you saying is that the problem is that Christian nation or Christian values are so underdetermined that they can mean anything or anything.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like, there's a lot of discussion about the concept of Christian nationalism at the moment. Christian nationalism is seen as this threat that is going to distort. This is a distortion of the gospel. Some people call it a sort of idolatry because it's the worship of the nation as if it was the church or as if it was God. Or some people think of it rather as a sort of syncretistic fusion of national identity and Christian identity. There's no doubt that there are certain elements or strands of that are troubling and worrisome, partly because they entail the idea that you should really impose Christian values by force on people. Whereas it seems to me, if I look at the way the New Testament treats the gospel, it doesn't ever try and force people to live by gospel values if they're not convinced of them. Christianity doesn't work by coercion, it works by invitation. It invites you to join of your own free will. It doesn't force you to join on pain of being imprisoned or killed if you don't join. And so what would it mean for I think Christian nationalism is also an underdetermined term. Like, it just depends on what people mean by it. If all you mean is that a nation is that you want your nation to be run according to Christian principles, then I don't think anybody could have a problem with that, right? Unless there's some extreme sort of Anabaptist positions with radical withdrawal from all politics and all government. But there's not very many Christians who adhere to that. If you think that politics if you think that a government can act in a way that is more or less Christian, then you're invested in trying to make it act in a way that is more Christian. And then you're automatically trying to invest your nation with Christianity. The real question is how you do that. Do you do it by sort of brute force, by muscling your way in, by underhanded tactics, or by, trampling on your opponents? Or do you do that just by the gentle art of persuasion and invitation, which seems to me more the way the gospel does things?
And just looking across to continental Europe in the last couple of decades, are there things we can learn from the way that the ways in which the relationship between Christianity and immigration policy have played out?
Yeah, I mean, in the book, I held up Germany and especially Angela Merkel as a good example of Christian values actually playing themselves out in the welcome of refugees. Everybody knows the story of what happened. It was already 11 years ago now in the 2015 Syrian refugee crisis. And Angela Merkel almost single-handedly, actually, like she didn't consult a whole lot of other people in her political party.
Which is the Christian Democrat Party, isn't it? So it's explicitly got Christian in the name.
It has, although I'm not sure how meaningful that is in the German context. She just opened the borders to Syrian refugees, and as everybody knows, within a few months, about 1 million of them had come into her country. That cost something. Germany is still struggling with integrating all of these Syrian refugees, and it has caused various societal issues, which some people point to those societal issues and say, well, Angela Merkel should never have done that. And I don't think that that's the lesson to be learned from it. Angela Merkel, she was operating very consciously out of what she thought was a Christian way of responding to the crisis. She was the daughter, she grew up as the daughter of a Lutheran pastor who himself had opened his home to disabled people and had a special care for the disabled, which is another kind of disadvantaged group, right? And what I argue in the book is that Angela Merkel was drawing on those childhood experiences of care for the marginalized, just transferring that care from the disabled to another marginalized group who was the ones who were in desperate need at the time.
Now, turning to our listeners, my guess is that very few of them, maybe none of them, will feel they have much direct influence on their nation's immigration policy. What do you think are the responsibilities or possibilities for individual Christians in this area?
Well, I mean, it's a democratic country, right? Like we our politicians are supposed to represent our own views. So I could easily talk about, helping out at refugee charities. And I do think that's important, or donating to refugee charities and that kind of thing. I'm not saying you shouldn't do that, but that's the low-hanging fruit. That's the easy thing. Getting to know real refugees will definitely help because it personalizes, it puts a personal face on what is often seen as an impersonal sort of threat or problem. So that doesn't always do everything, though, because I know a ton of people who still say, those immigrants are taking our jobs and taking our resources, except the ones who I personally know who are nice people.
Yeah. We've all come across that.
Yeah. And so I think we need to go up a level and we need to say, look, we need to give a voice in the political arena to the idea that immigration is not actually a bad thing. It's not something that we should resist. There can be limits on it for sure, but especially when we're talking about providing a home and protection to people who are in desperate need of it, to people who've lost everything, whose life and freedom is under threat, we don't need to be afraid of welcoming and integrating those people. And we need to let our politicians know that that's the kind of country we want to be. We want to be the kind of country that's known to be welcome and hospitable, not a country that has a hostile environment. I really could never really credit that hostile environment was like an official UK policy. Like, how is that Christian? So we need to tell our politicians that. We need to show them that there are people who actually care about immigrants, not just people who are defensively worrying about losing their jobs all the time.
Yeah. And moving from the individual to the church, what responsibilities do churches or church leaders have in this?
I think partnering with refugee charities. There's some great charities out there, like Welcome Churches is a good one, that networks different churches around, so that if a refugee or an asylum seeker is moved from one city to another, they can very quickly find welcome and support in that other place. I think Refugee Education UK does a great job of trying to enable especially young refugees to get access to education. So removing obstacles to education. There's lots of charities. Just get involved, get educated, and then get involved on the practical needs of the refugees and the immigrants in our society.
That's fantastic. I mean, I think you talked about the Good Samaritan and just the person you come across as being the one who is proximate to you. And certainly, church I was involved with a decade ago, it was precisely that Iranian asylum seekers had suddenly shown up, and
Yes.
And that just brought us into a whole different area of ministry that we hadn't been in before. We were learning as we went, but
That's true, but sometimes they're already in our midst and we don't see them. I think sometimes there can be, asylum seekers in a lodge nearby, and we just haven't heard of them. So sometimes I think a little bit of proactive effort is needed to go and find them. They're already there, but we don't always notice that they're there.
Fantastic. So tell me, just last couple of questions to close. What impact has this had on your own teaching, your own involvement with politics?
Well, that's a very good question. I think I would just say that it has made me aware of how important this issue is at the political level. Although, to be honest, everybody's aware of that right now. I think it's made me aware that it's hard for me to sort of distance it from my research, to be honest, because my research and my personal faith are so deeply intertwined that I sometimes just think of them as largely the same thing. But I don't want to pretend that just because this is the topic that I have chosen to investigate and research, that this is the most important topic for everybody. I think there are other candidates for important issues that Christians need to focus on, climate change being one, secularization being another, mental health crisis. There are a number of important crises and issues facing humanity that Christians need to respond to. AI is another one. This one is an important issue. I don't pretend that it's the most important issue just because it's the one that I'm looking at. But I would say that however important you think it is, however much of a priority it should have, then this is the way that it plays out in the way it should play out in your political life and in your political action. Not in defensiveness, not in putting up borders and restricting borders, not in such this sort of defensive, self-protective instinct, but rather in a vulnerable attitude of welcome and hospitality, which I would argue does extend up to the national political level and is not only an individual response.
Yeah, thank you. And final question. We began with your awareness, your coming to awareness of this issue through your involvement with local church. Any final thoughts on how this work has impacted your own faith and the way you live that out?
I think it's made me see how privileged I am as somebody born in a wealthy Western country. Some people say that that where you're born these days is the equivalent of the sort of feudal class structure that we had in the Middle Ages, where if you were born as nobility, then you were going to have an easy, comfortable life, and if you were born into a peasant family, then you were going to have a hard life. And now, if you're born in a wealthy Western nation, then your life is going to be not necessarily easy, but where you were born is not going to be a contributing factor to it being hard. And so it's made me aware that I'm just immensely, immensely privileged, and everybody is. It's very easy for us to get caught up in first world problems, right? Worrying about various issues that are really minuscule and of small importance compared with some of the serious, life-threatening crises that are facing a lot of other people in the world. And I'm an immigrant myself now. But I'm one of the most privileged immigrants you're going to come across, anybody's ever going to meet, because I speak the language. My culture is very similar to the culture I came from. I've gone to, and yet even I have found it hard. Mm-hmm. Even I have made mistakes that cost me a lot of money just because I didn't know the system very well. Even I have had trouble and difficulty and felt at sometimes like a second-class citizen or disadvantaged because I was not an American citizen. And if even I, one of the most privileged immigrants, have found it hard, how much harder is it for all of these other people who don't necessarily speak the language, who don't come from a similar culture, who don't even come from a similar religion, and who are more liable to make many, many different mistakes just because they don't understand the system? All of those people need help far, far more than somebody like I do.
Great. Well, you've pressed us to look afresh at Scripture, to look afresh at the world around us, and to look afresh at ourselves. Barnabas, thank you very much for coming on Talking Theology.
Thank you for the invitation. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Talking Theology, a podcast of Cranmer Hall, Durham, where we explore the best of academic theology and think creatively about how theological insights can shape Christian life, ministry, and mission in today's world. If you enjoyed this episode of Talking Theology, subscribe on your favourite podcast platform. Follow us on X or Instagram at Talking Theo and share on social media. Cranmer Hall is a vibrant and diverse Christian community, forming Christ-like leaders for today's church. We offer training courses and degrees from BA to doctorate, available full-time and part-time, and we are home to students from a wide range of churches. Bursaries and scholarships are available to help with the cost of study. For details, visit our website, cranmerhall.com.